Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Vice Chairman of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, Michael Peterson.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce our next panel. Building support for fiscal reform in Washington requires building support across America. After World War II, America reduced its debt levels significantly while also making important investments in the future. Our culture seems to have changed significantly since then. We've used to be big savers. Now our savings rate is virtually zero. Are we willing to pay for the government we want? Are young people adequately represented in this dialogue? Are we willing to be savers and investors instead of spenders? How does America get back into the future business? To sort this out, we've got a distinguished panel of experts to discuss these issues. New York Times columnist and best-selling author David Brooks, former Wyoming Senator Alan Simpson, co-chair of the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, David Cote, chairman and CEO of Honeywell, who also served on the commission, Tamara Draut, vice president of policy and programs at Demos, and the author of Strapped, Why America's 20 and 30-somethings Can't Get Ahead, and Megan McArdle, business and economics editor at The Atlantic. Moderating the panel is Ezra Klein, columnist for The Washington Post and Bloomberg, and he will help us sort through these issues. So we're honored to have you all join us, and welcome them, please.
We didn't come out on cue. Nice job, Michael.
Well, good afternoon. We have been introduced, and so many of us up here, except for me, speak for ourselves and on the debt. Wow, that was a terrible introduction. I should have written that. Anyway, we're here to talk about the culture of debt. So last night we all went out and ran up our credit cards, and we got a good sort of first-person take on it. But because there's nothing worse than 5 or 6 denizens of Washington sitting up on a stage and telling people what the American people think, we're going to be talking about myriad cultures of debt. We're going to be talking about the different ways in which the public, the preferences of the public, and the preferences of various groups of elites end up creating both some of the gridlock and some of the different types of solutions that we end up seeing to this problem. And so I'm going to start by asking everybody on the panel a sort of a beginning question before we go into individual questions, which is a week or two ago, Paul Krugman wrote an article in which he argued that there is a particular dodge that afflicts folks in Washington. And the dodge is this, that the reason we have a deficit, the reason we have a debt, is because the public just has incoherent views on fiscal policy. They want low taxes and they want very high spending. And Paul said that a lot of the debt had to do with the Bush tax cuts, which were favored by the public, but not necessarily public-driven. They voted for the guy who wanted the lockbox, as people remember. That a lot of the debt had to do with the war in Iraq, which was elite-driven, without a doubt, and a lot of it had to do with packages of mortgage bonds going bad, which, whatever else you think about it, wasn't what the public had hoped would happen. And so I wanted to ask, who is, insofar as anybody's responsible for the debt, is it the public? Is it Washington? Or is it some mixture, some alchemy between the two? And David, we'll just begin with you and then go right through.
Yeah, astonishingly, I think Paul's wrong on this one. After 6 months on the job, I deleted all my emails, and there were 290,000 emails, and the core message was, Paul Krugman is great, you suck. And so I'm resentful of Paul. No, I do think he's wrong. My basic view, if you look at the dumb polls, the political class response to the polls, people want more government than they're willing to pay for. And that shows up in the polls on Medicare, on tax cuts, on this and that. It's the tectonic structure of our debt problem. And so my question has always been, why now? Because every generation has an incentive to spend on itself and push costs onto future generations. And no generation has done it to the extent that we have. And that's partly because of demography. It's partly because of healthcare inflation. But I do think it's fundamentally an attitudinal change. which is that people, if you even go back to the New Deal, they had to spend a lot of money, but they had a visceral moral horror of debt. And I think that's because they had a sense of the chain of generations which they were going to soil if they ran up huge amounts of debt. And I have this mega cultural explanation, which I won't spin out because it takes too long. But essentially, we had two individualistic revolutions, culturally individualistic. One in the 60s, which was more about moral and social individualism. One in the 80s about economic individualism. But over the last 20 or 30 years, we've done quite well by individual freedom, and we've done quite poorly by civic commitment. And we've lost some of the sense of civicness, some of the sense of community. And I brought, because Alexis de Tocqueville just emailed me this, but I have a Tocqueville quote which captures, I think, the problem. Here's Tocqueville. Thus, not only does democracy make every man forget his ancestors, but it hides his descendants and separates his contemporaries from him. It throws him back forever upon himself alone and threatens in the end to confine him entirely within the solitude of his own heart. And this is a problematic of democracy exacerbated by these cultural problems, but it means we're more aware of our individual needs, and I think thus have a less of a moral horror at pushing debt. And I think that's essentially the cultural foundation of the problem.
Just out of curiosity, does Tocqueville use Hotmail or Gmail?
Tocqueville is old, so he uses AOL.
Oh, okay, got it. Senator?
Well, Paul Krugman has some very difficult times with Erskine Bowles and me. It's almost like a saliva test response. He's a benign curmudgeon, if that's proper, but that may not be for a Pulitzer Prize. But let me tell you how we got here. We were told, those of us in politics years ago, go to Washington and bring home the bacon. Go get the money. Go get the money for the dam and this and that and the road and the chairman and the appropriators were living it up. Now you can't get people on the appropriations committee. They're fearful of the result. But let me tell you, that's how it happened. We made promises we can't keep, and we had income we never dreamed of, and thanks to Erskine, who was one of the last to balance the budget under Bill Clinton. And as I always say now, you can't bring home the bacon anymore because the pig is dead. That's where we are, but that's where it started in my mind.
If I could build on Alan's point of view, because that's kind of where I am also, is I'm shocked that everybody's a little shocked at people's reaction to the polls. If you ask somebody, do you want higher taxes? And they say no. Do you want higher spending? And they say yes. That's actually perfectly logical, right? To the extent you can have a free lunch, it's a great idea. And if you say, hey, tell you what, we'll give you a free lunch, and not only that, this other guy's going to pay for it, you don't have to, that makes that free lunch seem even better. So I don't think it's an illogical reaction. One of the things that's frustrated me in this whole thing, though, is I've seen very little discussion with the American public about what the issue is. Instead, it always gets cast in some kind of framework, and Alan, I thought you always said this best when it came to, what was it, emotion, fear, guilt, racism. It always gets cast in that kind of a discussion, as opposed to saying, look, here's the issue that we're facing, and we have this demographic bubble, there's no way around it, and we need to act as a society in a responsible way, and we need to think this thing through. And I don't see anybody having that discussion. And I don't think that that's beyond the ken of the American public to be able to understand if we actually started to take the time to explain it. And I'd like to see a lot more of that kind of discussion if we're going to engage the American public, because I do think the more you've got voters pushing on the Congress to say, for God's sakes, do something, the greater chance we'll get something done.
So who's responsible for the debt, I think was the question. I would say bad policymaking. What's responsible for the debt is bad policymaking, fueled by two ideas that President Clinton actually mentioned this morning. One was this idea that government stinks. We might as well not support it with adequate revenue because it's going to bungle the job no matter what it is. And the second is the idea that that individual freedom really triumphs over the need to look out for one another and help the most vulnerable among us. That somehow if we provide decent security or benefits to workers, it's coddling them and ruining their work ethic. So I think it's been fueled by a really sort of nasty ideological current that has allowed us all to sort of say, okay, I'm not going to do anything about this. And for the public to accept the tax cuts that grew the debt because of a real sort of steady diet of anti-government rhetoric. It's hard to make a case for adequate revenues when it's a constant stream of information about how bad our government is.
Well, I think that, when you look at the polls on the deficit, the public clearly is irrational in some way. They say, if you ask them, do you care about the deficit? They say, yes, I care a lot. Do you want to raise taxes? No, except on like Warren Buffett and maybe 3 other people who are as rich as him, but not anyone who I might ever meet in real life should have their taxes raised. And then they say, well, what do you want to cut? And they want to cut foreign aid and maybe some welfare. And the most disturbing thing is that I asked the head of a polling firm, well, why don't you go back and show them what the numbers are? And he said, oh, no, we did that. They still say, I really care about the deficit, don't want to raise taxes on anyone except extremely rich people, and I don't want to cut anything except foreign aid. You can overdo that as an it is overdone as an excuse because everyone likes when, and you hear this all the time with talking about healthcare or taxes or whatever, right? Democrats roll out, well, the public really doesn't want to cut spending on Medicare, et cetera. And the public expresses equal fervor for not raising taxes on anyone except Warren Buffett. But they discount the side that disagrees with them and only can talk up. I think there really is this contradiction. And I think my sense of this, I happen to be related to the swing voter. My mother has actually correctly predicted the outcome of every presidential election since 1972 with her vote. So every 4 years I poll her, and then I do spot polls in between. And my take on what the kind of mushy middle of America thinks is that there is some common sense solution that is just evading, the politicians aren't getting it because they're just partisan jerks. And if they would just sit down together and they could do something that wouldn't involve really like cutting Medicare or raising taxes to a level that would be painful for a family making $70,000 a year, or in some other way that there's some easy way to resolve this. And then, but they can't because, as I say, they're partisan jerks. And then you have the other, say, 50% of the population, somewhat equally divided between parties, and what they're saying is, go be partisan jerks. And the end result of that is that I think you are seeing politicians react to that sentiment. It's the famous rhyme, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree. And similarly, don't cut anything that might ever give me any money because that is stuff that I earned. I'm a good, hardworking American citizen. Take money from some other jerk who doesn't deserve it and is just abusing the public trust. And as long as that dynamic continues, and as long as politicians, frankly, act to exacerbate it by campaigning and promising that the other side is lying and that really I've got an easy solution that doesn't involve doing anything you don't like, it only involves hurting someone you've never met. As long as that happens, they have incentives to do that, but I do think they're making it worse.
Mm-hmm.